All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We'll give everyone just a second to join in. See everyone joining. Hello. Welcome. Welcome. All right, you guys, we're going to go ahead and get started because we've got a lot of good content today. So today you're going to be hearing from Centauri Health Solutions, a PSA for smarter risk adjustment, predict, suspect, and act. Before I turn it over to the team, I do just want to go over a few housekeeping items. So you are going to notice that all of your cameras and mics are going to be off and muted for the duration of the webinar. This is just for your privacy. But if you do have any questions, please put those in the Q&A section down at the bottom of your screen. The team's going to do their best to answer all questions at the end of the webinar, but if there's any that they can't get to, not to worry, they'll follow up with you directly afterwards. And today's recording will be available on the RISE website as well as the slide deck tomorrow, and then you'll be getting an email as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dawn to get started.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Dawn Carter. I am Centauri's Senior Director of Healthcare Policy and Regulatory Affairs. Say that 5 times fast. And I'm joined today by my esteemed colleague and one of my favorite people to present with, and just favorite people, Ray Gross, who is Centauri's Coding Education Director. And so we are so excited to bring you some great content today. So I've got today's objectives here up on the screen, and I realize, that many folks in our audience, we probably got a wide range of, job titles and skill sets, and a lot of you might already have significant experience with analytics, because we are talking about predict, suspect, and act, and how to develop and implement a kind of a balanced risk adjustment strategy, which is what we'll be talking about today. But as I was considering topics for this webinar, I thought it was timely to highlight how we now have the resources and capabilities to do risk adjustment more intelligently as we continue to pursue the goals of value-based care. And we, of course, hear a lot about that in today's healthcare environment. Or, as you will soon understand to be a not so ideal strategy, analytics kind of lives in a silo. That's not so desirable of a strategy. And that silo is not necessarily visible to everyone else involved in risk adjustment. So this webinar will hopefully give you some insight into these analytics and how to kind of coax them out of the silo they might be living in. And you might also be new to risk adjustment. Everybody who knows me, and I know a lot of you are out there, knows that I love the newbies, and I want to make sure that the content we deliver is also educational for those just starting out or even those wanting to elevate their careers. So we'll gain clarity on predictive versus suspecting analytics because they are different, even though we often hear those terms used interchangeably. We're going to learn some analytics application from real world cases, and I've got 3 case studies for us to look at. We're going to strengthen and balance, give you those skills, the resources and capabilities that you'll need to balance those retrospective and prospective strategies, and also to elevate your thought leadership and value-based care, since risk adjustment is a big part of that. And on today's agenda, we've got introductions and definitions. We've got the foundations of these analytics, just to make sure we're understanding the requisite definitions, why we have to care about these and what it's the foundation for. And like I said, we'll do some deep dive into some cases for suspecting predictive analytics. We'll talk about integration of strategies and then have some time for some QA. So let's dig right in. All right, so by now, the definition of balanced risk adjustment probably looks familiar to you because it is part of an overall value-based care strategy. Now, historically, risk adjustment operational strategy has been largely retrospective and very siloed into chart retrieval and review, data submissions, and analytics. However, this has changed with widespread adoption of EHRs and interoperability standards, such as FHIR, that allow near real-time access to clinical data, and also with the help of artificial intelligence, such as machine learning and natural language processing. These things enable more robust predictive analytics and a greater emphasis on prospective strategies. So we're moving away from being only in that retrospective space, maybe a little bit prospective, to a more balanced strategy. Now, Interoperability, AI-enabled tools, and a lot of other analytics inform a more comprehensive, balanced strategy that we call intelligent risk adjustment. Now, balanced risk adjustment, as you see defined here, is a way to execute this more intelligent risk adjustment approach, and our focus today will be the analytics that are the bedrock of that balanced strategy. Later, my colleague Ray will be adding some relevant discussion related to operationalizing this strategy, including AI-enabled tools that we see commonly leveraged in the industry. So, we have balanced risk adjustment as leveraging both retrospective and prospective to optimize accuracy and compliance while improving patient outcomes. And the retrospective part of that is validating and capturing conditions from past encounters. And that ensures completeness for historical data. And prospective is predicting and identifying conditions before they occur or are documented. And that enables proactive interventions and closing care gaps. So why do we need to care about this? Why do we have to do this? And we've got 4 pillars we're going to talk about here. And these 4 reasons that support a balanced approach are probably also familiar to most of you, but I wanted to take a few moments to tie these to the recently released Medicare Advantage Advance Notice for calendar year 2027, which just came out. And then we had something similar, of course, on the ACA side that just came out. So if you work for ACA, you probably saw the notice on that side too. Because these proposals speak to the importance of these 4 pillars. And the first one, of course, is financial accuracy and revenue stability. Now, the 2027 proposal keeps payments essentially flat while tightening risk adjustment inputs, most notably by recalibrating the CMS HCC model and potentially excluding diagnoses from unlinked chart reviews. So a balanced retrospective and prospective approach is going to be critical. Now, one of the major aspects of the exclusion of diagnoses from unlinked chart reviews and revenue stability in general is that often overlooked is claims and encounter data integrity. And again, for those of you in the audience who know me, you know it is not surprising because I'm historically the data governance girl. In fact, I have a nickname that was given to me by someone in the industry, and I have a little name tag that says data therapist because I said, if you don't have good data at your foundation, you're going to have issues later on in the revenue cycle, including in risk adjustment. And so it's time for organizations to be sure to shore up their data governance and hygiene strategies. And that topic is worth a webinar in and of itself, and I've given many on that topic. So be sure to look for that if you're looking for some suggestions, help, guidance on shoring up those data governance strategies for your programs. The next pillar is our regulatory compliance pillar, one that I'm very familiar with because it's part of my title. And these are proposals in the notice elevate regulatory compliance, and it reflects CMS's emphasis on payment integrity and accurate auditable sources of diagnoses. Now, just before the notice was issued, we had additional guidance related to RADV. So the notice definitely put a point on the regulatory aspect. The third pillar we have is operational efficiency. Now, when we reduce reliance on the broad chart chasing in favor of integrated point of care, this advances operational efficiency. And so it helps us align resources with high yield encounters and closes the loop between suspecting, confirmation, and documentation. And last but not least is quality of care. We must always remember that in the end, the member is at the center of everything we do. And these other 3 reasons for a balanced approach support our clinicians' ability to deliver high quality, cost-effective care, which is the goal of value-based care. And interventions that help providers act earlier, things that are more proactive and prospective, enabled by analytics, support that goal. We must also effectively and efficiently get, access, and use as much data about members as possible as a foundation for all of this, which is where interoperable systems and AI-enabled capabilities come in. And to this end, I want to quote one of our industry's great entrepreneurs and thought leaders, John Gorman. Many of you out there probably know John, have met him. He's been around a long time, and he said something this week in one of his postings that really resonated. He said, quote, only plans with next-gen analytics and complex care management skills will remain profitable. Ignore these at your own peril, end quote. And so now let us turn our attention towards how we can create these balanced programs with these next-gen analytics. All right, we've come to our first polling question. I try to make this interactive because I know this is probably right after lunch for everybody. So tell me, which outcome matters most for your 2026-27 risk adjustment strategy? Is it financial accuracy and stability? Is it regulatory compliance? Is it provider experience, operational efficiency, burden, or member outcomes and quality of care? And I know that everybody cares about all of these things, but I'm just curious to see, where you are in your organization with what you need. Let's see, we've got responses still coming in. Trying to see what's in the lead. Financial accuracy and stability seems to be in the lead, followed by regulatory compliance, followed by member outcomes, and followed by provider experience. And we've still got some responses coming in. All right, now what we've got going on here is, all right, 33% said financial accuracy and stability, 31% about equal said regulatory compliance, followed by member outcomes, and then followed by provider experience. So hopefully in this webinar, we'll be able to give you some insight into how to affect change in the area that matters most for you and everything else as well. All right, so I'm going to close that down and we'll go on to our next interactive activity. Okay, so I thought we would have a little bit of fun. And just as kind of an aside and another little plug for Rise, this is a bingo game. And I'm actually going to give a roundtable at Rise National where we're going to play this bingo game. And I'm going to give a shorter, condensed version of this presentation. So obviously it's a little harder to play bingo with, 218 participants on a webinar. However, we're gonna do the best we can and do a little bingo here. So I thought it would be fun to take a few moments and talk about the risk adjustment strategies that do not contribute to balanced programs and a few words on why each is not so smart. So create your own bingo card, or, by marking off or mentally marking off which apply to your organization. And 5 in a row wins you a governance meeting. Of course, no fun prizes, no new cars. You get a car and you get a car. And none of that. It's a governance meeting if you get 5 or more. Just kidding, maybe. Okay, so we're gonna go down the list real quickly. Spray and pray suspects. This is one of my favorites. This is huge suspect list with weak precision floods workflows. All of these suspects all the time. But what all this does is creates a lot of work, which erodes trust and crowds out higher yield, more balanced work. Annual letter prospective, where this is where your prospective strategy is just a letter that goes out to everybody, reminding them to come in and get their PCP visits or wellness visits. Well, that doesn't necessarily equal the appropriate care that members need. And this requires visit conversion and current year documentation. So how many people are responding to the letter? Here's another one of my favorites, denial. This means you're ignoring denials. This is treating your denials as noise and not systemically addressing root causes of your denials. This blocks feedback loops and it hurts your suspecting and your retro accuracy. So important not to do that. How about the chart chasing Olympics? This is where people kind of think, oh, I've retrieved so many pages of records, but what has that yielded in terms of supported diagnoses? Without appropriate analytical guidance, this inflates your costs and really doesn't add any lift. How about RAF by wishful thinking? This is forecasts that are based on last year or problem lists rather than this year's assessed and supported conditions. So that's one definitely you want to avoid. Um, Predictive model museum piece. This is a stale, unmonitored predictive model. These have to be constantly updated. And later on, I'm going to tell you what kinds of people you need to be able to do that. And so if you don't, you're going to have poorer suspect prediction as models and populations change over time. How about outreach not equaling an appointment? This is very similar to the annual prospective where you're sending out, making calls, sending out postcards, but it's like, who's booking a visit? Who's keeping that visit? And then is it documented correctly? So it's great to do those things, but you've got to have that follow through and close the loop. How about a data lake with no fishing license? This is one of my favorites, being the data girl. This is data without access rules or catalogs, just all this data, but no way to meaningfully access or use it. This, of course, stalls analytics and results in just bad analysis and incomplete or inaccurate reporting. There's also the one and done annual wellness visit. This is treating the annual wellness visit as the only touch. And of course, we know that this is not what CMS wants. It's not that you can't do in-home visits and wellness visits. You've got to be sure that it's followed up with appropriate care for balanced risk adjustment. Models not equaling outcomes. We can have the world's best risk adjustment predictions, but if they don't lead to a booked visit, properly documented diagnoses, they're just numbers on a dashboard. Outcomes happen only when predictions trigger actions at the point of care and are captured with evidence. What about one-size-fits-all incentives? Misaligned incentives ignore panel mix and documentation quality, and this results in uneven performance. Note bloat. This is one we hear. Any clinicians that we've got out there, we've got note bloat with zero evidence. This has to do with long templates, maybe that are not appropriately designed without MEET, monitored, evaluated, assessed, or treated. These fail audits and just train clinicians to ignore prompts for the proper documentation. How about submitting now and fixing later? This is submitting unsupported diagnoses on encounters. This invites rejections, recoupments, just breaks trust with the whole operation. So this is where I talked about earlier, fixing those systemic data issues so you don't have to do it later when you get data that rejects and can't be included for risk adjustment. How about problem list hoarding? This is overgrown, uncurated problem lists. These mislead suspecting, which a lot of people don't realize, because they aren't really encounter level documentation. Some people probably recognize the provider fax avalanche, and people laugh. You're like, oh, do we still have fax machines? Yes, we do. And this week I have actually been attending the ASTP conference virtually, where this was talked about, where there's still faxing happening. And we know that faxing is slow and error prone. They steal time from prospective work and burn teams out having to deal with them. How about coding by gut feel? My coders out there are probably like, no, we use the coding guidelines, use coding clinic. Yes, but this is something we see. And so this is inferring diagnoses from labs or intuition versus provider documentation. We know that's non-compliant and risky. Something else that we see happening is measuring what's easy and not what matters. Things like, oh, we've retrieved so many pages of records or so many records. We have this many suspects instead of conversions or the audit pass rate or the net risk adjustment factor retained. You need to have things, measurements that matter. When teams optimize to these high volume, low friction counts of things because they're simple and look good on a dashboard, instead of tracking the few metrics that actually drive outcomes, compliance, and member experience, you get the illusion of progress without really improving care or audit defensibility. How about zero governance, infinite dashboards? Many charts, no stewards or definitions. These, kind of cause operations to stall out, and you have teams working off different sources of truth. Here's another one, vendor roulette, repeatedly piloting or swapping vendors. Without clear owners, success criteria, or integration, you're going to have all sorts of people stepping on each other. Vendors don't know what they're held accountable for. You're going to have a lot of conflicting numbers and little durable lift, meaning any results that are sustainable. HCCs without evidence, this goes without saying. Submitting risk diagnoses lacking appropriate current year encounter level support. Very similar to annual letter prospective and outreach equal appointment is outreach equals a postcard. This is a low effort. It masquerades as engagement, but is it really producing a visit and then a visit that has appropriate documentation? You have to be able to, again, measure what matters. How about silos everywhere? Plan, provider, vendor, product silos, blocking workflow loops. And so very important to, again, we're going to show you how to kind of break out of the silos everywhere approach. Ignoring social determinants of health. Everybody, and again, anybody who knows me know that I'm an SDOH warrior. I do a lot of work with health equity and SDOH. And unaddressed social barriers kill show rates, meaning people showing up for their appointments and, responding to outreach. Balancing these means removing the barriers such as transportation, any other thing that is preventing members from accessing care is something you want to pay attention to. And then last but not least, no model explainability. These are just kind of black box risk scores without drivers. And if you can't really explain them, clinicians aren't going to act and you can't really audit or improve anything. So we're going to flip to our next poll, and I'm going to say, which of these do you recognize in your own operations? Now choose as many that apply to you. So this is multiple choice, and be honest. Remember, the first step in correcting a problem is recognizing that it exists. And by attending this webinar, you are gaining the information you need to move forward. So yeah, be honest, tell me, what are your main concerns? I see some chart chasing Olympics, which is probably our little, it's like my nod to the Olympics. Yeah, we have a lot of chart chasing Olympics. Wow. RAF, we've got some RAF by wishful thinking. We have outreach not equaling appointment, which is very common. One and done annual wellness visit. One size fits all incentives. We have some provider fax avalanche. We have some predictive model, museum piece, HCCs without evidence, silos, yeah. All right, so we've got, it looks like we're, okay. And we can share the results. So it looks like chart chasing Olympics won. Wow, which is not surprising. And of course, this is kind of like just, chasing things with no rhyme or reason, or with logic that is not regularly visited for its propriety. So that was the overwhelming majority. A big one is outreach not equaling an appointment. And part of that is, the ability to measure that and getting to the root cause. Why aren't these outreach efforts resulting in an appointment? And then, of course, proper documentation for a condition. One and done annual wellness visit is very similar to that. Again, why is that happening? Why are we not following up to make sure that anything identified in a wellness visit is addressed in care? One size fits all incentives. Yeah, this one's 24% of you. And then we have problem list hoarding. That's 17%. That, Ray and I, that speaks to our coder, it's problem list hoarding. HCCs without evidence, silos, ignoring SDOH. So thank you guys, the 107 of you who spoke up, for being honest. We hope that, in our webinar today, you'll be able to learn some strategies that will help these go away. So, and if not, Ray and I pride ourselves on being very accessible experts. So you can always give us a call and we'll be happy to talk to you about what you would like to change. So, all right. Moving on. I guess I need to close that down. Okay. Another polling question. So this one's not so hard, I promise. So what does your overall risk adjustment strategy look like relative to retrospective and prospective strategies? Is it overwhelmingly retrospective? Is it balanced, neither overly retrospective or prospective? Number 3 is, what does prospective even mean? Or 4, balance is for gymnasts and wellness junkies and for people doing the Olympics. What do you guys think about this poll? And it may be that I accidentally X'd it out when I was, so you can just, give it some thought. Hopefully your answer is that it is balanced. There we go. Thank you. All right, we've got some 85 folks. We've got good, overwhelmingly retrospective. That's, certainly, that's what it's traditionally been, so not surprising. Followed by a balanced, which is it's very close, 44% to 42%, neither overly one or the other. Some don't know what that means, which is fine because we're going to tell you on this webinar. And 6 of you said balances for gymnasts and wellness junkies. So, all right, I can't argue with that either. So, all right. Thank you so much for indulging me with polls. And now I promise we're going to get to some foundations. All right. So, as I said previously, we often think that predictive and suspecting analytics are the same and that these concepts are interchangeable, but they are not. They are actually different. And knowing this difference is the key to being able to inform the right balance of your retrospective and prospective strategies for your program using these analytics. Now, I put here, there are, of course, many analytics, but I put 3 that we commonly see here that, again, for the folks that are newer, you might be like, what are some examples of predictive analytics? These are things that forecast future events or outcomes. So commonly we do risk score forecasting. So example is predicting which members are likely to develop diabetes within the next 12 months based on lab testing like hemoglobin A1C and other typical lab tests, their BMI, and their medication history. So again, leveraging data for that purpose. Another one we see is hospitalization prediction. So these might be identifying members that are high risk for an inpatient admission during the next quarter. So we do that using claims, using access to, EHR data gained through interoperability, which I mentioned earlier, and social determinants of health. And another one we often see is medication adherence prediction, because of course that also is very predictive of chronic illness and outcomes. And this is forecasting which patients are likely to become non-adherent to their chronic medications. So predictive analytics is forecasting future events or outcomes. And then we have suspecting analytics. And so these identify undocumented but likely existing conditions. And examples of this that we see, we do this on a condition level. So this would be perhaps a member who has multiple prescriptions for insulin and elevated hemoglobin A1C, but no diabetes diagnosis codes. So this would flag as a suspected diabetes condition. Also, we look for HCC gaps. So this is detecting missing chronic conditions like COPD when spirometry results and prescriptions suggest that it is present. So any condition could fall in here. And then also we target for chart review using suspecting analytics because we want to flag for members for retrospective chart review because their indicators suggest undocumented conditions. Because as you all know, you can't retrieve every chart for every member. It's just not possible to do that. And you want to find the charts that are going to net the conditions, right? So you have to have analytics to help you do that. And that's what suspecting does. So in summary, remember the key difference is that predictive is future risk forecasting. So who might get sick or need care? And suspecting is current documentation gap detection. So this is who likely already has a condition, but it's just not coded or documented. Okay, so another polling question. Where do you see the biggest near-term lift in your risk adjustment program? And this would be in the predictive area, meaning the forecasting and using some of those common analytics I mentioned. Would it be suspecting, looking at undocumented but likely, or some sort of a hybrid, which is predict, suspect, confirm, or act, or you're unsure? All right. So far, it looks like we've got a hybrid, which is good. That's kind of what I would expect to see. And again, if you're not sure, that's all right too, because you might not work in the area where you are exposed to that, or you're not sure, like who even does that at your organization. And I'm going to tell you that too towards the end. All right, we still got some results coming in. All right, again, overwhelming majority, 52% is hybrid, which is good. That's kind of what I would expect, and then we've got some that are more predictive, some that are suspecting, and some that are unsure. And that's okay. All right, so moving right along, we're going to roll into some case studies now. So let's look at some real world examples that illustrate how these tools uncover hidden conditions and drive better outcomes. So these case studies will hopefully show you how multiple data sources come together to identify gaps and then trigger actionable steps. So predicting, suspecting, and acting. So first we have for suspecting analytics, I want you to meet Mary. Mary is a 67-year-old Medicare Advantage member, and on paper, she looks pretty healthy. Her documented chronic conditions include hypertension and hyperlipidemia. She's had 2 primary care visits and 1 ER visit in the last year. Nothing unusual, right? But when we dig deeper into the data obtained via clinical data interchange, again, interoperability, and AI-enabled analytics, a different story emerges. Now, when we look at her claims, so over here in that big blue circle, her claims data shows multiple prescriptions for insulin and glucose test strips based on the presence of corresponding HCPC and CPT code on her claims. Her lab results show that she's got a hemoglobin A1C of 8.4% within the last 3 months. And when we apply natural language processing to her EHR notes, so the electronic health record, we find phrases like monitoring blood sugars and diabetes education. Here's the catch. We don't see an ICD-10 code for diabetes documented anywhere in that record. So this is where our suspecting analytics come in. Algorithms, flag Mary is a high priority suspect because the data strongly suggests that she has diabetes, which is a condition that carries significant weight in risk adjustment models. This is for commercial, Medicare Advantage, anywhere. Diabetes is a high dollar condition. Missing this documentation not only impacts financial accuracy, because remember, we talked about our 4 pillars, but also care planning for her. So what happens next? Well, at the next visit, the provider will likely get a point of care alert in that EHR when she comes in for care. Something like, member likely has diabetes. Confirm and document if clinically appropriate. Now, the care management team will initiate outreach, probably schedule a wellness visit to address it, and provide education to her. And for added reassurance, Mary would also be flagged for retrospective chart review to validate the condition and ensure accurate coding. So what's the outcome of this? So all the way over here in this last circle, the provider confirms that diabetes diagnosis and documents it appropriately. Mary's care plan is updated to include diabetes management, and the organization improves both clinical quality and their financial performance. So that's suspecting in action with Mary. Let's take a look at something similar for our predictive analytics. So meet Lee, who is a 68-year-old Medicare Advantage member who has documented chronic conditions. He's got congestive heart failure and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD. On the surface, Mr. Lee's condition seems stable. He's on his medications and he's had routine visits. But predictive analytics run on his data tell a different story. So the predictive model flags Mr. Lee as high risk for hospitalization in the next 90 days. Why? Because the model analyzes multiple data points. He's had frequent ED visits over the past 6 months. His medication adherence patterns show gaps in his refills for his heart medications. Also, They took a look at his social determinants of health, and this screening, which can be embedded, by the way, in an EHR clinical workflow via a template, reveals that Mr. Lee lives alone and has transportation challenges, making it really hard for him to attend his follow-up appointments. Now, these factors all combine to create a very strong signal that Mr. Lee is at risk of an acute episode requiring hospitalization. So, what happens next? Well, the care management team receives an alert in their system and initiates a home health referral to provide in home support for Mr. Lee. This is really also because he's got some transportation issues that were found in that SDOH screening. They also might set up remote monitoring for him for weight and oxygen levels, which enable early detection of deterioration. And I can even speak from personal experience where my mother-in-law actually wears like a heart monitor that sends alerts to her PCP if there are irregularities because she's been having some issues. And so I'm like, gosh, what an interesting time we live in. So it's just this as real time as possible that an intervention can happen if she's found to be outside of normal limits. Additionally, for him, they arrange transportation to reduce barriers of care. When he needs to go for labs or when he needs, whatever he needs to do, they know that he has transportation's an issue. So what's the outcome? Well, he avoids hospitalization. He stays stable at home, and the organization reduces avoidable costs while improving Mr. Lee's quality of life. So next, let's take a look at how predictive analytics can help us anticipate what we call risk score drift. This is a common challenge in risk adjustment programs. This is kind of where risk scores are not quite what they are predicted to be, or they are drifting from a baseline. So in this case, meet Angela. Angela is 72 years old. She's a Medicare Advantage member. Last year, Angela had multiple chronic conditions documented, including diabetes with complications, COPD, and chronic kidney disease. These conditions contributed significantly to the risk score. And we all know the CKD alone, what that does to a risk score. But here's the challenge. Our predictive model has flagged Angela as high risk for risk score decline in the upcoming year. So this is where it's like, okay, that's unexpected. So we're seeing the drift here. Why? Because the model analyzes historical coding patterns and provider engagement data, and it finds, so here's what it finds. Dropped HCCs in prior years. Angela's diabetes complications were documented inconsistently across visits. Also, it finds provider engagement signals. Her primary care provider has lower historical compliance with annual wellness visits and coding completeness. Because remember, we have to be monitoring provider engagement and clinical documentation. See here how the analysis of provider coding patterns becomes absolutely relevant. Care gaps. We find no recent lab results or specialist visits that typically support chronic condition documentation, especially for someone like this. If these conditions aren't recaptured, Angela's risk score will drop significantly, which impacts both revenue and care planning. So what happens next? Well, again, a care team receives an alert and prioritizes Angela for proactive outreach. There's that word again, proactive. They schedule an annual wellness visit and ensure labs are ordered to support accurate documentation. Also, in this case, provider engagement tools deliver point of care prompts during the visit so that those conditions can be confirmed and properly documented. So what's the outcome here? Angela's conditions are appropriately documented, her risk score remains accurate, and the organization avoids financial loss while ensuring continuity of her care. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ray to talk to us about closing that loop through our PSA, predicting, suspecting, and acting. Ray, take it away.
Thank you, Dawn. So, all of you have heard so much now about the predicting and suspecting, but now we've got to close that loop, so to speak. So, we have to think about, anchoring your compliance guardrails as well as your operational realities. which are going to make your retrospective coding strategic in 2026. So we have to talk about some different ways to help that lift. And then we're also going to talk about things that can actually drag down that process a little bit. So the first thing, when you are implementing these policies and things are done well, you're going to have that strategic lift. So we're going to talk about some different items. So we have, first we'll talk a little bit about payment accuracy and stability. So you have to think that through your coding, that reflects the true disease burden. Okay, so how are things documented and how are they coded on the backside? So you have to be thinking about whether there's going to be, if your documentation is supportive and your coding, you're going to have fewer disallowed HCCs if you are looking at what is documented by the provider. You will then begin to notice that year over year, you're going to see less of the risk score drift that Dawn was just talking about. So, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a later slide. But we also have to think about RADV risk mitigation. And I think this is one that's very huge. So ideally, we're talking about lowering the unsupported diagnoses rate, because now, as we know, that as different organizations are going through these RADV audits, there's always that chance of extrapolation, and which CMS will come in and recoup and recover monies that were paid to these providers. So we really have to do what we can to make sure that we are having these diagnoses that are supported through the documentation. So as coders are coding from the documentation, you don't have to worry so heavily about having that information extrapolated, having the monies extrapolated back from the providers. In order to do that, we have to think about our compliance plans that we have. So many organizations feel as though a compliance plan can be a heavy financial burden to the organization, but you have to think about that from the investment that you're putting into it to the downstream that you're going to receive from that expense up front. So if you have that strong compliance plan in place, and compliance plan is going to look at things as far as how audits are being performed on staff, the frequency and the amount, that investment up front is going to help you on the back end. So you are going to see a return of that investment for having a strong compliance plan, having, your compliance officers that are engaging with the staff, making sure that we're keeping up with these processes. That's going to be very, very important. We also have to think about smarter prospective targeting. So in that retrospective side, so you're going to have the prospective that's taking place, but remember, everything is going to eventually trickle down retrospectively for a review. So you have to think about prospective work being done. You have that retrospective component. And in the middle of all of these things, we're also going to be talking about queries with providers. So queries help to learn and sharpen the suspecting logic and the point of care prompts. So depending on what type of prompts you're putting in, you're going to have that higher acceptance by providers. We all know providers are very busy. And so we're having to think about the different types of queries that we're putting in. And are they, accurate? Are they, something that a provider, would really want to engage with? So then that brings us to operational velocity increases. So this is kind of the heavier part here. So when you think about operational velocity increases, that is in tune with FHIR, which is Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. So you think about how the processes, how fast everything moves through the organization. So you're talking about everything from retrieval and all the way to submission, right? So when you think about using an interoperable retrieval, you're thinking about a standardized electronic health data interchange. So you're quickly pulling information from the EHRs and how that information is being passed quickly through all the way up to the coding process. So as long as you have a strong electronic data interchange process in place, it's going to do several things. It's going to, first of all, shorten the time between suspecting all the way through submission. So when you identify a suspected diagnosis, and Dawn talked a lot about the different suspected diagnoses, you need to have the documentation to back up against that information. So in other words, you're going to have the suspected diagnosis, and now you're looking for the documentation to confirm it so that you can submit it. And so by using an FHIR, you're going to be able to retrieve that information faster, and that reduces the time from the suspected condition to a validated documentation, and now to be able to submit to the health plan or the system. You also are needing to free the capacity for prospective gaps in care. So you're going to spend less time chasing charts, and you have a better way to focus on preventing future care gaps. And that's going to be that forward-looking approach. Now, we've talked a little bit about when things are done well, how it's going to improve the speed and the accuracy of coding from going all the way from the prospective side to the retrospective side. But I think the part we need to talk about the most is what happens when things are done poorly and what a drag that will have on your organization. So we're going to talk about a few things. So one is going to be the possibility of either having overpayments or underpayments. So let's talk about each of those. So when you have an overpayment, that can be a financial risk to your organization. So we talked a little bit ago about having monies extrapolated back from the organization. So when you have overpayments, this is usually resulting in diagnoses that were submitted to CMS without that proper documentation. And generally those are going to be, done through the lack of audits within your organization. So make sure that you're having those proper audits. Some of these things happen when diagnoses are submitted and they are unsupported within the documentation. So, you always want to reduce that risk of having an organization have to send money back to, CMS. The flip side of that is just as bad as having overcoding is having undercoding. So that results in an underpayment of monies to your organization. So those miswraps. So going back to what Dawn talked about a little bit ago, you have valid diagnoses that were not documented. So going back to her diabetes example, they were not documented and so therefore not submitted. So I'll talk about from the retrospective side of things that I heavily work on. We see a lot of documentation where things are written down and we pretty much know what the provider possibly meant, but it never made its way to the documentation. So that's going to be that resulting of the underpayment. Okay. So now the organization is really receiving less money than they would have had the documentation, everything had been properly documented. So another thing we have to think about as a drag to the organization is provider fatigue and distrust. So you're probably wondering, what does that even mean? So there are many times that we do have to query providers. And so those queries can actually result in, provider fatigue and distrust for a couple of different reasons. So one of which is that the provider is getting too many prompts and alerts that they have to answer. So when there's too many coming in, sometimes it may appear that they're being led to push for a certain diagnosis that they know that the patient does not have. They also, some of these queries can be low in value, meaning that they're not clinically relevant to what the provider is trying to address with the patients. So when those things happen, the providers actually may start to tune them out a little bit. So they really see it as a burden to them. They're already very busy. They have a lot of documentation. So we have to be mindful and careful of the types of queries that we're submitting and the amounts that we're submitting. And when they start to have this fatigue, they may become very skeptical in the system that's actually providing them. So we have to be really mindful of the quality and quantity of the queries that are being submitted to the providers. Then we also have to think about the lower prospective close rates. So what I mean by that is when these providers are starting to receive, additional queries which they do not feel are maybe clinically relevant, or they're feeling pushed to put down diagnoses the patients didn't have, the providers maybe likely will stop engaging these prompts. So that will, in essence, that will lead to further and fewer prospective care gaps. So they may not want to address these conditions with the patient going further. So we really have to think about the queries that we're submitting and, the validity of them, and making sure that you're not over prompting. And the final area we're going to talk about when it comes to those, ones that can be a drag on the organization would be the model decay. So Dawn talks a little bit about, some of the, NLP and AI, and we all know that that's a reality right now. However, depending how your systems are set up, if you do not have things set up correctly, you can have model decay. And what that means is that you're receiving more false positives that will land themselves into future cycles. So what that means is, just as we know about computers, everything is, systems are always learning. It's a constant tool. So over time, learning models can become less accurate. And this can happen if it was trained on by noise levels, very heavy noise. So in other words, labels were wrong. It was inconsistent. There was low quality being put into it. The labels can be unsupported. So in other words, there's a suspected condition that was never confirmed within the actual documentation. So while these models are training, you have to make sure that you're reducing the amount of errors that's coming out of them. So remember, as systems are learning, they may be learning models and they may be learning patterns that are not real. So we really have to look heavily at the models and what data is being pulled from it. So you may end up resulting in more false positives in the future cycle. So it's really important that as you are starting to engage with any of these AI tools or NLPs, there is always going to maintain a human behind these things. We will never be in a cycle where humans will not be part of the processes, because otherwise we're going to end up getting a bad result on the back end. So if the model learns bad data from the very beginning, later on, and we're talking years later, there may be more members that flagged incorrectly. So we have to keep those things in mind. We also have to make sure that, we're not flagging things that a provider cannot confirm. And really the increase in the noise will ultimately put a burden on providers and staff, and will ultimately result in, unnecessary work. So now we're going to talk a little bit about KPIs, which, if you're not familiar, are key performance indicators that we really need to look heavily at. So for these KPIs, we need to make sure that we're having measures to track what is being done in the organization. And this is going to be from the work that coders do internally, as well as matching up with the RADV disallowed rates. So when we're thinking about the coder pass rate, you really need to think about internally, how are you auditing your coders? Do you have a 10% review that you do of your coders, and then at that 95% accuracy rate? You really need to focus heavily on what's going on internally, so that you're starting to, when it goes over to RADV, you don't want to have a high disallowed rate. So by performing these internal audits, you really can help yourself in that regard. So when you're thinking about the suspected matching up to the supported diagnosis. You're looking at how many of your suspected conditions are later turning into confirmed with valid documentation. So a high rate of your suspecting model process indicates that it's accurate. A low rate means that there are too many false positives or your documentation isn't supportive enough. So when you're thinking about, we talked about compliance plans, that's going to kind of come in tune to, how are you auditing your staff, what frequency and what level. You also want to think about your record completeness time. So the time that it gets from coding all the way to submission. And also just want to add in, I know we're running a little short on time here, but want to mention that, in the middle of that process, you have to think about your vital queries, which I talked a little bit about a little while ago. But the queries are also thrown into that process to making sure that you're having a faster time from all the way from retrieval to coding to submission. And then you want to make sure that, all of these things you're doing is going to result in, better documented charts, coders making fewer errors, and then also that's going to increase the amount of, accuracy of claims being submitted for RADV audits. You're going to reduce any chance of, monies being extrapolated back. And it's really going to not only decrease provider fatigue, but I think ultimately will also reduce coder fatigue and just the entire staff in general.
All right. Thank you, Ray. And so we'll flip back over, really quickly because our time together is coming to an end. Just to remind that when we talk about intelligent balanced risk adjustment, it's not just about the analytics that help us look backward or forward. It's about leveraging those analytical processes to create a connected workflow that leverages both retrospective and prospective approaches. And the key enabler here are these analytics we've been talking about. And why is suspecting so powerful in the first place? Because it feeds both sides of the equation. It feeds retrospective because it identifies members with those gaps in documentation. It allows us to prioritize our resources better for more targeted chart reviews and focusing those resources where they matter the most instead of just these broad, inefficient reviews, sort of like spray and pray, like what we talked about, or just these chart chasing Olympics. Also, at the same time, suspecting drives point of care interventions that are part of a robust prospective strategies. And they have to be smart point of care interventions because, like Ray talked about, you can fatigue the providers and cause distrust and fatigue your staff. So by surfacing these conditions, providers receive timely prompts and they can confirm and document conditions right there while they've got the member in the room. This is paired with provider education and ensuring that coding accuracy and compliance. So we also have at the basis of this financial modeling, which helps us quantify the impact of these interventions and to prioritize them, like which ones, prospective versus retrospective, are going to yield the best and most compliant ROI. And that's going to look very, very different from organization to organization because everyone is different in terms of their population, the disease burden, and what's going to be needed for that population. So as we bring our time together today to a close, I wanted to say a few words about who develops these predictive models and the suspecting algorithms and logic. Because like Ray said, there are always humans behind this. We might have AI-enabled tools and algorithms and other things helping us do the heavy lifting with the data, because let's face it, it's not possible for, a human or even some humans to do all of the data processing and analysis that's necessary. But if you have the right people on your team, it's a lot easier. And so people who develop predictive models are typically data scientists and machine learning engineers. actuaries and folks who work in actuarial analytics, and also clinical experts and health informaticists. So usually a mix of these people are who develops these predictive models. And it's, as you can see, almost there's always a clinician in the mix here, no matter whether it's predictive models or your suspecting logic. Now, who builds the suspecting logic is your risk adjustment analysts, your clinical coders and compliance specialists, and also your technology vendors and health plans often help as well. So, in short, we know that predictive models are built with, your more advanced machine learning, AI algorithms, plus your actuarial and other input. And your suspecting logic is more rule-based and clinical validation. And together, these form the backbone of hybrid workflows for your retrospective and prospective strategies. So as we come to the end of our time together today, I just wanted to say in summary, we didn't just talk about models or metrics. We mapped a way to see risk earlier and to care more precisely. So we'll leave here with one commitment: close the loop from data to insight, from insight to action, and from action to the outcomes that we are ready to defend, meaning we're going to predict with purpose, we're going to suspect with rigor, and we're going to act with intelligence. And so now let's get to work. And I want to thank you for joining us today. I'm going to pass it back over to Bailey for some post-event housekeeping. Bailey?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dawn and Ray, for a great presentation today. And thank you to Centauri Health Solutions for putting on today's webinar and sponsoring. I just want to give a friendly reminder that you will be receiving a copy of today's recording as well as the slide deck from RISE tomorrow via email. This will also be available on the RISE website. And you will be seeing a survey pop up on your screen once you close out of the webinar. If you could just take a few moments, answer those 3 questions for us, it would be greatly appreciated. But with that, this concludes today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you all next time. Have a good one.